who is a colleague and a friend working with us at IFILNOVA for quite a few years already. Gianfranco Ferraro is one of the driving forces also behind this research project on fragmentation and reconfiguration, experiencing the city between art and philosophy. And actually this theme on the catastrophe was proposed by Gianfranco as, and of course it's a concept and a topic that is quite of interest for what we are doing now. And Gianfranco Ferraro has been working on several topics, philosophical topics related with the philosophy of Foucault, Max Weber, Nietzsche, and so on. And he's been working also on the topics of the, how do you say it in English, the forms de vida, forms of living, I'm sorry, and this part of the research group forms of living in IFILNOVA. Art of living. Art of living. Art of living. And he's been working on these topics related to the catastrophe, to utopia as well. And it is also in this context that he is doing a PhD also in global studies and theology in the Universidade Aberta more recently. So, Gianfranco Ferraro's presentation is called Between Catastrophe and Apocalypse, the City as Heterotopia.
So, thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to share with you these little notes about Catastrophe, about the relation between Catastrophe and the city, that base somehow also my studies and my approach to Catastrophe, and both in an intellectual sense, both also in a sort of autobiographic, being the two cities of Lisbon and Messina, my two homelands somehow in Portugal and in Italy, in Sicily, and both are were affected by earthquakes of course, in different times. Well, so these are two forms of approaching Catastrophe that I named in my title as Catastrophe and Apocalypse, acquired a sense for my idea if we put in touch, we put in connection with the notion of heterotopia that was studied by Foucault in a text published just in the 80s, but that was already written in 60s. Well, I share with you some slides just to follow better my my presentation. Well, my idea about this. Well. So. We can see, yes, just to check, yes, that's okay. So between Catastrophe and Apocalypse, the city as a heterotopia. The problem, well, I want to face is the possibility to interpret somehow the city, and not just a part of the city, just not a moment of the city, as can happen if we imagine a monument or something that can remember an event like a catastrophe in the city. What I imagine is the possibility to understand the whole city as a heterotopia. The whole city that is, in this case, the city where catastrophe happened. So just to distinguish the two words which give the title to my presentation, catastrophe and apocalypse. In which sense we speak about catastrophe and in which sense we speak about apocalypse. As we know, catastrophe means in English overturn, and apocalypse is another Greek word, means revelation. So we can say that catastrophe is an interruption of a norm, an event which brings back normality to a condition it had already overcrossed. In another sense, apocalypse is a sort of a catastrophe. So we can say that there is a very very strong relation between apocalypse and catastrophe. But apocalypse can be interpreted as a catastrophe which reveals something, sometimes a truth about the normality that precedes somehow the same catastrophe. So, just in two sentences, we can argue that all the apocalypses are also catastrophes, but not all the catastrophes are apocalyptical. So, this distinction between catastrophe and apocalypse, the idea that an apocalypse must be a catastrophe, but that not all the catastrophe can be apocalyptical, of course, can be connected with the meanings of the two terms that we have to mind for the rest of this dialogue. Well, when we speak about the apocalyptical archetype, that is also a catastrophic archetype, we of course can mind to the biblical account of Sodom and Gomorrah. Maybe not for a case in epochs of great crisis, like in 16th and 17th century, we can see some representation of this Gomorrah, what I mean with a Gomorrah archetype, in pictures and just not in picture. And so the Gomorrah archetype, the destruction is a destruction of a city, a destruction that means condemnation of the natural elements and also, or in contemporary, of the God's will. But what I can stress is the fact that this Gomorrah archetype, the apocalyptical archetype, is to put in connection with the city. So it's very difficult to imagine an apocalypse or a catastrophe that which does not make sense for a city. A city is a place where a catastrophe or an apocalypse can happen, and an apocalypse or a catastrophe is something that makes sense just in relation with a city. Just to continue with the study of the notion of apocalypse, I would mention this anthropologist, this Italian anthropologist, Ernesto De Martino, that made many studies in the southern Italy, and particularly that is my interest for him, a great and unfinished study concerning the apocalyptical forms of living and the cultural apocalypses. In a text that was published in Italy just in 2002 and published again just last year in the middle of the pandemic apocalypse, and that has not yet, unfortunately, an English or Portuguese translation. This anthropologist tries to develop a history of the apocalyptical events or the apocalyptical forms of cultural living. And an expression he uses in this text is ethos of transcendence. That is, an ethos, a form of connection with among people that allows to the same peoples to living in a way that makes sense as a world. Human pass par excellence as energy transpassing situations, I'm quoting, as an ensemble making and at the same time operative valorization. And nevertheless, same De Martino, the pivotal point remains the following: to carry the proof, to model again and again through the enhancing work the domesticity of the world. So this ethos of transcendence is made by actions, is an active ethos on the base of which every culture is built. On the contrary, what happens if an ethos of transcendence disappears? In that case, Ernesto De Martino discovers the presence of a psychopathological past. That is the possibility of a cultural apocalypse. In other words, a cultural apocalypse is a disappearing of the ethos of transcendence, the possibility that for people who live in a world, that the world does not make sense yet. As the psychopathological past, the end of the world is the experience of a radical risk, incompatible with culture, the experience of not being able to start any possible world, of not being able to pass beyond the situation into the realm of value. Precisely because we are in the world as operative presences, we emerge and remain in it, inasmuch as we carry out the valorizing energy of transcending the situation. The risk of not being able to carry out this energy, experiencing its fall, assumes the form of the radical risk of a final and definitive catastrophe. And I want to stress this difference Ernesto De Martino makes, that is an apocalypse, an apocalyptical possibility, or a final and definitive catastrophe, something that cannot be valorized as nor as apocalypse, a definitive catastrophe of the world that is preceded by an apocalyptical living. Well, in the just in the right part of the slide, we see, of course, two images of an earthquake. In the first case, an image of the Lisbon earthquake. In the second case, the earthquake of Messina. So the question I suppose we can do at this point are: can we approach the urban space as a scenario in which what is at stake is the ethos of transcendence, in which a culture manifests its own techniques, aims to guaranteeing the cultural and the psychological permanence of a world? If we consider cities of a catastrophe in particular, we must answer in the affirmative, and this for two reasons. On the one hand, because in these spaces we observe concrete ways of overcoming trauma through a reconstruction, sometimes utopian, and we will see how, of the city, and through the construction of memorials, of monuments dedicated to traumatic events. On the other hand, because the city is the scene of a catastrophic past that can be narrated anew, becoming an object of historical and artistic forms of representation. So, if the city of a catastrophe can be seen as a great object to study and to understand in what consists really culturally an apocalypse or a catastrophe, at the same time, the city where a catastrophe happened, as are the case, of course, of Lisbon, of Messina, in the case of the natural catastrophes, but as are the cases of Dresden or Hamburg or Hiroshima, no? In the case of human-originated catastrophes, we can see the reconstruction of the city, that is, the city which overpassed the catastrophe as a sort of heterotopia. Why? To use this term I take from Michel Foucault, as I said. In that text that Foucault wrote in 60s and then published again in 80s, Foucault explained what was for him heterotopology, a sort of systematic description that would have the object in a given society of studying, analyzing, describing, reading, as people are fond of saying now, these different spaces, these other spaces, a kind of contestation, both mythical and real, of the space in which we live. So there are some heterotopias, some other spaces already in the cities we live. And Foucault makes some examples, are the cemeteries, for instance, or we are in a museum that is a great example of heterotopia. In another space, not directly useful for the life of the city, but that we can cross to report to our daily life some meaning that makes sense and mirror somehow our normality or our daily life. In the sense, heterotopias are also a bit different from the utopias. As Foucault writes, utopias afford consolation. Although they have no real locality, there is nevertheless a fantastic, untroubled region in which they are able to unfold. They open up cities with vast avenues, superbly planted gardens, countries where life is easy, even though the road to them is chimerical. Heterotopias are disturbing, probably because they secretly undermine language, because they make it impossible to name this and that, because they shatter or tangle common names, because they destroy syntax in advance. And not only the syntax with which we construct sentences, but also that less apparent syntax which causes words and things, next to and also opposite one another, to all together. This is why utopias permit fables and discourse. They run with the very grain of language, and they are part of the fundamental dimension of the fabula. Heterotopias, such as those to be found so often in Borges, desiccate speech, stop words in their tracks, contest the very possibility of grammar at its source. They dissolve our myths and sterilize the lyricism of our sentences. Well, I tried, but we can discuss about them, to give some of the heterotopias in the sense, in the meaning of Foucault, that are some rests of catastrophes that already appear in the cities where a catastrophe occurred. That is the case of Gedächtniskirche in Berlin, between parentheses, the same place where occurred the terrorist attacks just some years ago. The Genbaku Dome in Hiroshima, and then National September 11 Memorial in New York, where was built a sort of great void space where the Twin Towers had been built. Well, another example to understand which is Heterotopia for Foucault is the case of the mirror. I see in the mirror, I see myself where I am not, in a real space that opens up virtually behind the surface. I am over there where I am not, a kind of shadow that gives me my own visibility, that enables me to look at myself there where I am absent, a mirror utopia. So the mirror as a real space, the mirror is not an unreal space, is a real space that allows to my presence to appear differently, so to make my position quite different from it was apparently in reality. But it is also a heterotopia, the mirror, in that the mirror really exists, in that it has a sort of return effect on the place that I occupy. Due to the mirror, I discover myself absent at the place where I am, since I see myself over there. From that gaze which settles on me, as it were, I come back to myself, and I begin once more to direct my eyes toward myself and to reconstitute myself there where I am. So we have the three concepts more or less organized now: catastrophe, apocalypse, and heterotopia. Heterotopia appears as in the places of catastrophe, also to, and in this case we can connect the two terms of catastrophe and apocalypse, just to connect a catastrophe to the sense, to the meaning of apocalypse, without transforming the places of catastrophe in heterotopia. Extremely difficultly we could interpret a catastrophe as heterotopia. Of course, heterotopia is also something that allows that art of memory mentioned by Jan Asman, an Egyptologist, but also an historian, who wrote this so well-known book about cultural memory. Just some quotation about this. However, this art of memory has very little in common with what is assumed here under the concept of memory culture, Erinnerungskultur. The art of memory relates to the individual and presents techniques to help form personal memory. By contrast, memory culture is concerned with a social obligation and is firmly linked to the group. The question here is, what must we not forget? Through cultural memory, human life gains a second dimension or a second time, and this remains through all the stages of cultural evolution. The heterogenization of time, the production of non-simultaneity, the possibility of living in two times is one of the universal functions of cultural memory, or to be more precise, of culture as memory. So, just to stress, the production of non-simultaneity. In a place of a catastrophe and in a city thought as a heterotopia, as a catastrophic heterotopia, we can precisely see this production of non-simultaneity. That is the case, for instance, of Lisbon too. By absorbing the event of the catastrophe culturally, the fatal destiny of the place, a community rewrites both its history and its own present. Through its ruins, the memory of a catastrophe also draws a specific cartography of a place, of a city, a rewriting of its roads, of its squares, a new relation between the past, the present, and the possibilities of the future. A city that has lived a catastrophe necessarily has its own inner relation, its models of a cartography. Ruins occupy a specific place, define an order of discourse that involves a way of conceiving of the space and its languages. In this sense, the city of the catastrophe can produce its own architectonic or urban utopias, can invent models of being that are necessary both for moving beyond the trauma and for reinventing a way of reimagining the possibility of living through another catastrophe should one occur in the future. So, non-simultaneity also in this sense, non-simultaneity towards the past and non-simultaneity towards the future, towards the possibility of another catastrophe appearing. Its cultural techniques develop utopias based on new materials, on new kind of construction. In the city of catastrophe, the image of apocalypse and utopia find a common root. The city itself represents a heterotopia for its inhabitants. Their steps remain in a present that is intersected by the steps of other times. And so about this idea of rebuilding the cities of a catastrophe as a heterotopia, just I give an image of the consequences of the fact that, for instance, Messina and Lisboa and just on the left are put on the same border of two tectonic structures. The movements of which produced the earthquake of Lisbon, 5 minutes, the earthquake of Lisbon, as well as the earthquake of Messina. So we can see here, for instance, how after the earthquake of Lisbon in 1755, Lisbon city center was rebuilt through the rationalist form of the Baixa, and how, of course, the catastrophe in this case reveals its apocalyptical force in the sense of to reveal the forces, the economic and the architectonic forces that are able at this time. The same Filippo Juvar that was an architect and urbanist of Messina, a rationalist urbanist, had projected before the Lisbon's earthquake renovation of the royal palace just in 1717. So we can see that the earthquake produces a sense that makes sense if we begin from the forms of action of the techniques that are operating in a culture. The same thing, exactly the same thing, appears in the case of Messina, where the frequent earthquake, just the case of 17 and 83 and 1908, Luciano Marabello and Pietro Saitta will speak much more about this afternoon. These earthquakes are taken as forms of rethinking the city in the different ages. Just a point, just to stress here how the Lisbon's earthquake of 1783 and Messina earthquake of 1908 force the urbanists and the architects to an obsession that we can see as very, very, very similar, a sort of obsession for an escape. The rationalist different forms in which the Bash Pombalina is built and in which also the map was, Messina was rebuilt after the earthquake, testify somehow this obsession of the escape. And I think that also literature as a role in building the cities of a catastrophe as heterotopias. This is the case, for instance, of a poet from Messina, Yolanda Insana, who wrote about the earthquakes and the living people, the survivors that after the earthquake discovered the possibility to live and to build a sense for the catastrophe that had appeared. Just to testify or to add another form of technique, another technique through which architecture or sculpture in this case can produce cities as heterotopia. I just want to mention the case of Alberto Burri and the reconstruction of Gibellina, that was really a little town in Italy, that in 1968 had a great earthquake. Just don't. Well, in this case, Alberto Burri produces the sense of as an heterotopia, so a possibility of rethinking the meaning of the natural catastrophe, just to build a memorial that is a sort of a memorial where visitors can pass through. Something in the same way is testified by the Denkmal für die Armut den Juden Europas that was made in Berlin, and somehow also the no monument, we can see sort of a testifying object, testifying operating object that was put just next to the Gedenkten Kirche to remember the terroristic attacks of the Christmas. Well, so different forms of taking contact with the catastrophe through heterotopical techniques. We can mention the cases of recovering the castles in Pompeii, or the cases of Leopardi's leechers, or the cases for Hamburg and Hiroshima's traumas of the recovering the memories that were done by Michiko Ahia with its testifying of the destruction of Hiroshima taken by Canetti, and the case of Sebald that on the natural history of destruction gave for the first time in Germany the word, the possibility to speak to a trauma that until this time, it is really the very end of the 20th century, did not have been spoken and expressed. So the city of Catastrophe, in this sense, through some different techniques, of course we can mention so quickly, can be imagined or thought as a sort of living heterotopia. And only by developing specific techniques that are able to absorb, to assume the trauma without pretending to remove it, can the memory and the presentiment of the end, so there's an idea of imaging the catastrophe towards the past and towards the future, can the memory and the presentiment of the end be prevented from becoming angst provoked by the feeling of the end of all possible worlds. So through the heterotopia, through heterotopical techniques, we can transform the catastrophes that occurred in a real apocalyptical forms of living who can testify through, of course, the possibility and the fear that this possibility can occur, can testify and produce a form to face really and not abstractly the reality of that world that can disappear and continue to disappear. Well, thank you. That is.
Thank you very much, Gianfranco. We'll still have a few minutes, not many, but a few minutes for questions and discussions, which we can, of course, continue throughout the lunch and the afternoon. But if you want to...
I suggest this.
But if any of the presents want... Filomena, yes, please.
Thank you very much. That's Franco. It was really very interesting. Make me think about many differences. Of destruction and the natural history of destruction. And those heterotopical techniques you talked about lately in your paper have to do with this mirror that Michel Foucault talks about, the use of mirror as a technical heterotopia, heterotopian, I don't know how the English say, because it seemed to me that Jan Hassman said something very different from Ernesto de Martino. They were very different about culture, and I did not understood this production of non-simultaneity. Let me know if I am wrong with my interpretation. The real heterotopian thinking would be a suspension of non-simultaneity. It would be so? I'm not sure I have really...
It is as I'm interpreting this, of course.
Because I think that one of the catastrophes of the inhabiting the earth, talking about humans, is the reduction of time to succession, to series, and not to simultaneity. Simultaneity is like a dream, is like a desire of being together, not only with those who are really present, actually present, but with those who have been dead. And then the memorial is a case of facing the desire of simultaneity and not the opposite. But I think that your interpretation of the effects of earthquakes in Messina and Lisbon, I liked very much to hear you about this, but at the same time, I would like to hear more about cultural catastrophe. I thought about Herman Broch when I don't know, I never read Ernesto de Martino, but I really was interested by you to read him. But this end of the world as the end of a certain memory is, for me, by all means, the end of the possible community, the possible simultaneity.
So I don't know if in the meeting could hear what Professor Mulder said. Someone is saying now that the question were not here. So well, I can resume, summarize a little bit what was said. That is a doubt, if you can say, concerning the relation I made between Jan Assmann and Jan Assmann concept of non-simultaneity and the Martino concept of cultural apocalypse. Well, the meaning of heterotopia, of a sort of technique that produce this non-simultaneity, no? In this case, and another thing, thing that Professor Mulder had asked was concerning the cultural catastrophe, which is the meaning of cultural catastrophe for De Martino in particular. Well, I'm really I think that definitely the text of Ernesto de Martino must be or should be translated in other languages, because I consider him really a great anthropologist and one of the few that can face also, for instance, philosophy or many other disciplinaries, can put together many other disciplines to understand the notion, the concept of cultural apocalypse. And I think that Martin, in this sense, continues to represent yeah, okay. So yeah, De Martino is continues to be a point of reference for this kind of studies. About non-simultaneity, of course, the sense of Jan Assmann is quite different from the sense of De Martino in this in the sense, and Jan Assmann is absolutely influenced by Benjamin, by Walter Benjamin, for also developing this sense of non-simultaneity. Why do I put in connection this sense of non-simultaneity in relation, and put in relation with the monument, for instance, or the memorials of the cities of Catastrophe, and the idea of catastrophic heterotopia? Because for what, for instance, the same Foucault says about the heterotopia, that is something as a mirror in which we can pass, we can cross, and we can understand something of our normal way of living, or our normal life. In the sense, a catastrophic heterotopia, catastrophic memorial, produce a condition of non-simultaneity that in this case is what exactly Assmann gives as the meaning of a cultural memory that can be biographically or culturally absorbed for living in a time also connected to another time that can be in the future, in the possible of the catastrophe, or in the past of an occurred catastrophe. Well, that is just to summarize the topics we touched. I don't know if I answered it to all, but we can discuss maybe more later. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.